Good evening again, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see so many of you out on well, it's quite a pleasant November night, but it's still a Monday, isn't it? Welcome to the second of our Richmond Arts Festival events. I don't know how many of you attended the first, but we're very glad to see you again. I just wanted to say a little bit about Arts Richmond. I'll make this one quick because I was told last time I went on too long. This is just a little bit about what we do if you don't already know. We are really sort of represent the huge richness of volunteer arts provision in our borough, and a rich and diverse, a range of arts it is. And arts are coming back to life now in Richmond after the pandemic, and we can just see more and more every day. So we're very, very pleased to be doing this. I joined Arts Richmond. I'm one of the affiliates of Arts Richmond. As some of you know, I run a opera group locally called Instant Opera. You might see a few of these about, and we were at Richmond Theatre last month. But now affiliates and members of Arts Richmond number in the hundreds, and we do everything we can to support them locally, and all the great events we do, or that they do rather. In addition to that, we run a year-round calendar of high-quality events, of which this is part of, so do look out for those. There was radio plays recently, and there's going to be the Young Writers Festival next month. So they're all the year round. Do look out for those. We'd like anybody to join us who's not a member. You can become a member or an affiliate if you have or represent an arts group yourself. So do look out on our website. You can pick up a newsletter downstairs. Have a look at that, see what you think. We'd love to have you join us if you're not already members. And our website, of course, artsrichmond.org.uk. We're very active on social media and Twitter as well. So do take a look at that and see what you think. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce a remarkable evening and a conversation which I know you're going to enjoy and be fascinated by. And we have our very special guest, Peter Rickets, who is going to be interviewed this evening. Now, Peter has been at the heart of Britain's foreign policy for more than 30 years. He was the top civil servant in the Foreign Commonwealth Office from 2006 to 2010, and we even share a small memory in the FCO. In that capacity, he established the National Security Council and was Prime Minister Cameron's closest advisor on defence and foreign policy issues. He was the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, UK Permanent Representative to NATO, Permanent Secretary in the Foreign Office, and the government's first National Security Advisor and Ambassador to France from 2012 to 2016. After retirement in 2016, Peter became a crossbench member of the House of Lords. He has written regularly for the FT, Times, the New Statesman and Prospect, and regularly appears on Sky News and the BBC. Hard Choices, What Britain Does Next, published earlier this year, is his first book. Hard Choices has been described as a bracing, stimulating, utterly timely call for the UK to take a very hard look at its place in the world, post-Brexit and after COVID. Peter Rickets tells us that we have nothing to lose but our illusions. The Financial Times said, as one of Britain's top diplomats, Rickets had a close-up view of some of the most dramatic events of recent decades. He takes a tough-minded look at the country's post-Brexit options and making a case for realistic internationalism and renewed engagement with Europe. David Miliband adds, Peter Rickets has put all of his experience and authority into this clear, accessible, and unvarnished account of Britain's place in the world. If you really want to understand the big choices ahead, read this book. We are delighted to welcome again, and she was with us for one of our events last May, Geeta Guru-Murthy, who has agreed very kindly to interview Peter, and I'm sure we're going to be treated to a fascinating discussion. There's going to be some time for questions and, of course, the opportunity to buy Peter's book, and he's very kindly agreed to sign copies as well. So, without further ado, let me welcome both of you, Peter and Geeta.
very much indeed, Nick. I hope you can hear me with this microphone. Is that all right? Let's hope so. Um, it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's a great honour and privilege to meet you, Lord Ricketts, Peter, and to read this book, which is fascinating. And it starts with a historical look at the last few years in terms of, especially on the focus on the modern day institutions, whether they are working, whether they're under threat, how you have worked within those international processes. And you then go on to address many of the big questions that we're facing today. And it clearly feels like we're at a huge turning point with the pandemic and Brexit and the rise of China. There are so many massive issues ahead of us and huge choices for any government. I just want to start, though, because I'm a daily news journalist, with what's happened today, which is an increased threat level announced by the government. What's your reaction to that, and how worrying is it, and was it predictable?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Geeta, and like you, I'm delighted to be here with a live audience. It's so nice to realize that it's not just people behind a computer screen. I don't think we should be more worried today than we were yesterday or the day before, in the sense that this threat from terrorism is always with us. This was obviously a shocking and frightening attack in Liverpool, and we're far from understanding what on earth was going on there. But we live with it all the time. Political leaders tend to want to react to each individual episode by upping the threat level or making some dramatic statements. In fact, ever since 9/11, 20 years ago, we've been living with a terrorist threat. And it's just worth bearing in mind that we were all worried then that there might be other mass casualty attacks on the scale of 9/11. And I think it's a credit to our security services that they have worked so well to keep that level of threat at least down. We've had some awful attacks in this country and elsewhere, but none at the scale of 9/11. So it is a really serious law and order problem. I would not say it's a first order national security risk to the country as a whole.
I'm sure we will come back to security, but because 9/11 is still in our minds, in your book you mention where you were when those attacks first hit, and you're, as one would expect, very diplomatic. You say who you were with, you don't say what was said, and I was intrigued as I was reading it to know what actually was said in that moment.
And I wish I could have total recall of what was said 20 years ago, and I'm always slightly suspicious of books that write in the first person, in direct speech. We can all remember, I'm sure, where we were when we heard the terrible news of 9/11. I was actually sitting in the Foreign Secretary's office, Jack Straw, and we were having a meeting with Jeff Hoon, who was then the Defence Secretary, and the Chief of the Defence Staff. Not about terrorism at all. I mean, it was about whatever the international crisis of the moment was that morning. And we were called out to watch an event on the television screen in the office outside in the private secretary's room. And it looked like, at first, that a small plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. And so the immediate thought was, my God, what a terrible accident. How on earth could that happen? And while we were watching, the second plane hit. And at that point, we all knew, as I'm sure everybody here realized, this is something, not just serious. This is world changing. This is a massive attack on America and on all our countries. And I mean, the discussion roughly went, well, who on earth could do this? It was pretty clear straight away that it was this Al-Qaeda group who had already attacked an American warship and also killed a lot of American Marines in Africa. So I think we pretty quickly imagined that that's what it must be. Nobody could have imagined how this had been planned without our intelligence apparatus knowing something about it. And then the thing that sticks in my mind most particularly was that Jeff Hoon, the Defence Secretary, then said, wow, I think I'd better go back to the MOD and see to the air defence of London, because there could be one heading for a block in the city right now. And so he and the Chief of Defence Staff went rather rapidly and slightly ashen-faced across the road to look at the defences of the United Kingdom in this. This had changed the whole threat picture. That's what I remember most particularly.
Yeah. You were in an extraordinary place at that point, and I just wanted to mention that because you've obviously lived and worked through extraordinary moments in recent history. But you start your book really talking about how the US stepped back from the world. You have a very interesting quote going back to George Washington in his farewell address to the US Congress, saying, "'Tis our clear policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world," saying that has rung in the ears of US statesmen ever since. Of course, we had the responses to 9/11, which changed the course of US history, but then we've had this reversion again to sort of US isolationism under the last 2 or 3 leaders in the US. I just wonder now, where we are right now in 2021, do you fear a world where the US steps back too much and you are left to China and Russia?
Well, I do fear a world, or I think it's almost inevitable, that America has changed in the last 10 years or so, perhaps 20 years since 9/11. Because what you say is right. The center of gravity of American international policy has been quite isolationist, looking back over 2 centuries. And I think we may come to find that that 70 years after the Second World War, when the Americans basically underwrote the security of Europe through NATO and were prepared to deploy huge numbers of troops here, provide, of course, their nuclear umbrella, and take a very active part in trying to promote the liberal democratic order, which was of such interest to the European countries, that period might be the aberration, and that America might be reverting to a more nationalist, self-centered approach to policy. And if that is true, and of course that's where American public opinion is leading, then that is pretty bad news for Europe, because we have grown accustomed to having this American protector with their umbrella over us. And if that is going to gradually withdraw, as America, for their own national reasons, puts much more emphasis on China, and what is likely to be, I think, a generational confrontation between America and China for dominance in Asia, and to their own national problems, it's a deeply divided and polarized country, then the Europeans have got some quite hard questions to think about how they are going to step up and do more for their own security. And the UK, in a world which is fracturing, I think, between an American-led world, a Chinese-led world, and the Europeans trying to keep a corner of liberal democratic values here, where does Britain put itself in that world? And that, I think, is what I try to address in the book, really. Our natural instinct is often to side with the Americans come what may. That's what we've done with the Australians over the submarine deal. But actually, we're a European country. You know, we're still anchored to Europe. We're 20 miles away from Calais, and we still look out at the world from a European perspective. So I think the choices and the dilemmas for Britain are sharper, perhaps than for any other Western country, because we've chosen this moment to leave the EU. That's really what I'm talking about in the book.
We will come back to that. And I should have said at the beginning that we're sort of aiming for half an hour of chat with Lord Ricketts, and then we'll allow for half an hour of questions from you and from anyone who's watching at home as well online. Thank you for all of those people who might be joining us too. And just to sort of root your argument, you make this historic argument, and you talk about Sir Alexander Cadogan, who's sort of one of the heroes, I guess, of your story. Why is he so important to you?
When I was a young Foreign Office diplomat, I found hanging on the wall of the permanent secretary, the top civil servant's office, this document, a rather flimsy document, with dark ink over it. It was the final draft of this Atlantic Charter, which we celebrated this year, 80th anniversary, signed in 1941 between Churchill and Roosevelt. And the Foreign Office had the last draft with Churchill's final manuscript amendments. And I was always fascinated by it. I put it back on the wall when I was the permanent secretary. And when I retired, I did some more research on it. It was actually written by Sir Alexander Cadogan, who was the permanent secretary in the Foreign Office throughout the Second World War, not as well known as the great military commanders and so on. But he was with Churchill on a warship in a Canadian bay in 1941. He was the only Foreign Office official with Churchill. And Roosevelt said to Churchill, "Why don't you guys produce a declaration on the future peace? What do we want to see in the future peace?" This was 1941, right in the middle of the darkest days of the war. And Cadogan sat down at the Admiral's table and wrote out principles for the future peace, which basically went into the UN Charter, and are still very much the framework of international relations today, about non-use of force for territorial aggrandizement and um, right of self-determination, and some of the key principles. And it seemed to me that the Atlantic Charter was the foundation stone for what we have now got used to calling the international rules-based order, or some variation of that. It was basically a US-UK production that went on into the UN, which was also very much designed by the US and the UK. It was, to me, the preeminent example of how Britain can have influence in the world by having good ideas and by working with our friends and allies in a very determined and consistent way to deliver them and turn the ideas into durable international institutions. So I wanted to use the Atlantic Charter to point to a time when Britain really could think deeply, long term, and make a difference by working effectively with others. And you may detect in amongst there somewhere some rather unsubtle points about how I think the country now needs to operate to be effective today.
We will come on to that in a moment. You are pessimistic, for example, at the moment about the UN Security Council. Do you think these international bodies are fit for purpose given the huge power shifts that we've seen?
Well, the Security Council is not fit for purpose, clearly, because it's not able to do the job it was designed to do. It's log-jammed by great power disagreements. And since the great powers, the five powers, have a veto, if Russia and China and America are in disagreement, the Security Council is stuck. That's been true, actually, ever since the Cold War. But the veto in the Security Council was the price that everyone agreed to pay to have America and the Soviet Union into the UN in the first place. If there hadn't been a veto, they wouldn't have joined. And we'd have back with that problem of the League of Nations after the First World War, where the Americans stood aside. So it's far from ideal. But I do say in the book, I really believe that we could not possibly design another global institution today in the fractured, polarized state of the world. So the UN is the only one we've got. We better try and make it work. And if the Security Council is bust, well, let's look at the agencies like the WHO, like the agencies that do such good work in humanitarian area, children and education and feeding those famine-struck countries and so on. The UN agency network is, again, something we could not replicate today as a global network. And in the end, it's the agencies are what the member states make them. If the governance is bad and the financing is insufficient, it's the member states of the UN who should fix that. So I would say let's work to reform what we have rather than assume that the UN is now out of date and kind of leave it aside, because there will be no other global alternative, I don't think.
And when we look at the role of Britain, Alok Sharma yesterday in his news conference said he thought that COP26 was global Britain in action. You are fairly clear on your views of Brexit and how it happened, and I would like to ask you a little bit more about that. But just on that line, again, what do you make of that?
Well, I think that that is struggling a bit to add content to this phrase global Britain, which is frankly a slogan rather than a strategy. Of course, Britain has for many, many decades been good at convening international conferences, writing the declaration because it tends to be in English, using the skills of the diplomats and civil servants and the skills of British ministers trained in Parliament as effective conciliators and consensus builders. That's absolutely right. I mean, COP26 is in the UK because the UK bid for it 5 years ago, just as the G7 summit in Cornwall was in Cornwall because it was Britain's turn this year on the rotating basis. So I don't think it's very good as an illustration of what global Britain is. I think it shows that if a country works hard in convening and extracting at least some incremental progress on a difficult global issue, that is useful. And I would pay tribute to the British negotiators for that. But I still think global Britain is a kind of phrase in search of a meaning.
You left government at the top of government in 2016 before the referendum, but you must work very closely with David Cameron. Do you remember when you first heard that he was going to call this referendum, and what was your initial take on it? Did you advise him on it?
I didn't advise him on him. I heard about it, I suppose, when other people did. It began to be talked about 3 or 4 years before. And I had a succession of ministers coming to Paris when I was ambassador in 2013, 14, 15, as the debate about having a referendum gathered force, they were all told by French ministers, for heaven's sake, don't hold a referendum on Europe. We know about that in France. We held two, actually. One we won by the narrowest squeaky margin when Chirac was president, and we held another referendum at the time of the famous Constitution, which Giscard d'Estaing presided, which we lost. And in the end, it had to go back and be reworked, and we had to find a way around a French veto. So for heaven's sake, don't have a referendum on an issue as complex as Europe and reduce it to a yes or no answer. And ministers were consistently told that by the French. They saw that very clearly. And I have to say I rather agreed. I thought trying to resolve the tensions of Britain's relationship with the EU with a single word answer question was not going to work. I mean, even if the answer had come out the other way around, it would have left a large part of the country unsatisfied. So I thought it was very risky from the very start, but I didn't really get the opportunity once I was ambassador in Paris to say that privately to David Cameron. I think plenty of other people were saying it to him as well.
And I get the sense from what you've written that your biggest regret in a way over Brexit is the loss of influence. Is that correct? And when you look at it now, if we look at where we are now, how optimistic are you about Britain's future outside the EU?
I certainly don't want to refight the old battles of Brexit, but I do think that Britain has lost real reputation and influence in the world by the chaotic way in which Brexit was handled, even after the vote has taken. I really wish that Theresa May had taken some time out when she became Prime Minister to hold a kind of national commission or something to work out what did this vote mean, because there were so many different strands behind people's votes in the Brexit referendum. I think it would have been time very well spent to just pause for a year. It was up to us to trigger, as you remember, the 2-year process, and try and work out something, if not a consensus, at least some kind of agreed principles of what kind of future relationship with the EU we wanted. I think at the beginning, in the early stages, people's assumption was it would still be a close relationship. You know, we are still in Europe even if we've left the EU, and by the kind of dynamic of these things, those with the strongest and hardest and sharpest views pushed, most effectively, and the Brexit has become harder and harder as it's gone along. Still getting harder right now, in fact. So, I mean, my regrets are, first of all, that I do not think Britain can be an effective global country with a dysfunctional relationship with Europe. And also in the terms of the economic and security damage that has been done to this country by putting up barriers between us and our largest trading market and our closest neighbors in terms of foreign policy and security. And so I would like to see a process of reconnecting and getting a working relationship going start as soon as possible. I can't say I'm very optimistic right now that it's going to happen, immediately. Although I am very confident that in 10 or 15 years' time, the next generation, now in their 20s and 30s, when they grow up into power and hold the positions of power in the press, in government, in parliament, that they will have a different view on Europe. They grew up with Erasmus. They grew up with EasyJet and Eurorail and freedom of movement around, and freedom to work and study and love wherever they wanted to. I don't think that we will have the same ideological baggage hindering UK and the EU from getting on effectively together in 10 or 15 years' time. But I fear there's quite a long time between now and then.
And yes, in the more immediate short term, I don't know what you're hearing. You've got obviously lots of contacts, I'm sure, still in government and in France. War of words, is it going to escalate?
Well, there's a real war of words going on between the UK and France, which I personally find very, very dispiriting, because we ought to be closest of allies and friends in so many areas. I mean, all our history points in that direction. And of course, we've always had ups and downs and tantrums and rows and difficulties, rather like siblings do. But this is serious. I mean, here there is a real loss of confidence, particularly in Paris, towards the British government, and therefore no great appetite to try and get over the rows, whether it's about fishing licenses or migrants crossing the channel or the Australian submarine deal or indeed the Brexit issues. And I don't think either side at the moment see much political interest in repairing things, unlike the Americans, who I think rise realized quite quickly after the deal with Australia that they had not handled the French well, and they've been leaning over backwards to reconnect with Paris, and I don't see the same from the British government. We need to have a good relationship with France. I mean, whether it's in security or defense or economics, or just in the day-to-day relationships of associations, charities, families, friends. We can't afford to have a deep division between the UK and France. So I really, really think that both governments need to step back from the spats at the moment and take a rather more mature view.
The government has obviously stressed the tilt to the Indo-Pacific. Given the rise of China, we've seen that AUKUS deal. Is it justified? John Bew's done this sort of huge strategic review, of course, Professor Bew. Isn't it right that the government's energy should go in that direction?
Well, I think it's worth trying to unpack this a little bit. First of all, absolutely I agree that Britain ought to be putting more effort into economic relations with that whole Asia-Pacific area, now fashionably called the Indo-Pacific. Of course, it's the most dynamic economic area on the planet. Britain has many historical relationships there. We understand a lot of the region, and it's very good that we should put more effort in. But let's not pretend that Britain is ever going to be a primary economic or security actor in that vast part of the world. We will only ever be a secondary player. It's the Americans among Western countries who will be the dominant force in that part of the world. And we should not spend so much time on the Indo-Pacific that we neglect what is our largest market and our closest relationships, which are in Europe. And my worry, two worries. One is that the government are trying to, as it were, airbrush Europe out of anything that they do or say or any priority given to anything in favor of maximizing everything they can think of in terms of relationship with the Indo-Pacific. I think that's out of kilter. And I also think the relationship with China, which is at the center of this, is really vital for the UK as for other countries. At the moment, I think the trend is towards lining up as closely as possible with the Americans in a pretty confrontational approach to China. Except that we've just taken a very large economic hit from leaving the EU. China is the world's most dynamic large market. I don't think we can afford, literally afford in the economic sense, to have an adversarial relationship with China across the board. So I think we need to be searching for that point of balance between security vigilance, but commercial cooperation where it does not impinge on our security. By the way, I think that's about the same place that the European countries are looking for as well. And therefore, I don't want to see us sucked into a completely American-dominated bloc, very confrontational with China, because I'm not sure that's a comfortable place for the UK with our many other interests in the world. And by the way, we've just seen on climate change that we need to be able to talk to the Chinese on global issues as well.
We've seen a split within the Conservatives, haven't we? The Osborne-Cameron courting of China effectively. It's felt, certainly in terms of economic terms, the current government moving in a very different direction. You write very interestingly about Huawei as well. Is there an argument there that the West was slightly asleep whilst China was spreading influence in the last 10 to 15 years? I know, working as a journalist for the BBC, more on our international output, we have, talked about what was happening in the African countries. We've talked about the security threats that India and that people have felt in that region, and it's just not really had the same level of interest or coverage here in the last 15 years, and it has only very recently come to public attention. Did this government miss that? And is it right? Is it even plausible that you can deal with China in this rather sensitive fashion that you're suggesting?
On the first point, yes, I think that is absolutely fair. I'm not as critical of the Cameron-Osborne golden era in Chinese relations with China as some people are, because at that point, 2010, we'd had a long period of 30 years of the Chinese actually trying to cooperate and work their way into the global economy. They were busy growing, and the Deng Xiaoping policy from the 1970s was to grow economically, to become powerful. And they wanted to cooperate. That's where they became the factory of the world, effectively. Enormous amounts of Western investment in China, and it seemed to be a win-win. What really changed was Xi Jinping, the new Chinese president, when he came in 2011, 2012, took a much more aggressive adversarial approach to the West. I think the initiative came from the Chinese side to toughen things up enormously. So in a way, the situation has changed and therefore British policy has to change. But I think you're right. I think actually right up to about 2017 or something, if you'd asked security professionals what our top 2 security risks were, they would have said, number 1, terrorism, going back to what we were saying. Number 2, probably the series of international interventions that we'd been taking part in under Blair and then Cameron, the Balkans, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. And those were the central focus. And in amongst all that, I think we did rather underestimate that China was growing, was developing its security apparatus, its defense power, all that time. And although I don't ever give much credit to Trump for anything, I think Trump did see and did begin to take a much more hawkish line on China. And I think others sort of woke up then. Of course, in the UK, it was also Hong Kong and the awful Chinese crackdown on the human rights movements and democratic freedoms in Hong Kong that really brought this home to a British audience. But I think up to that point, it's fair that we had not seen this, what the Americans call great power rivalry, coming back on the stage where it really was.
I'm going to open to questions in a moment. I just wanted to ask you one big question that troubles me, I suppose, a lot. Having covered, as you said, everything in the last 20 years on the international front, from the safety of the studio mostly, but it's been an extraordinary 2 decades in international relations. Is it naive to think that we or any country can have an ethical foreign policy, a values-based foreign policy? If we look at what happened in Afghanistan just now and the West pulled out, was that also basically about China and versus the US, China supporting Pakistan, Pakistan getting support from other Middle East nations and supporting the Taliban, and the US just deciding politically they've had enough, they're not going to go there, it's not worth it, regardless of the humanitarian consequences?
Yeah, I mean, it's the central problem in foreign policy, actually, because everybody wants Britain to have an ethical foreign policy, to stand up for our values, human rights, individual freedoms, the rule of law, protection of women, and quite rightly so. But foreign policy is a difficult, messy, ambiguous business. And it is quite dangerous to make that the centerpiece of your foreign policy, because you will find that you can't often live up to it. Robin Cook famously declared that the Labour Party were going to pursue an ethical foreign policy in government, and then ran into all kinds of problems with arms sales to dodgy regimes and so on. And that is the problem, that you have to deal with countries in the real world who are have a terrible human rights record, but you nonetheless still need to deal with them. In the case of the UK, for example, we have a large national interest in arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Well, Saudi Arabia's human rights record is not, doesn't bear very close scrutiny. China, ditto, other countries as well, and yet we still have to deal with them. And on Afghanistan, you illustrate the point, because President Joe Biden got elected on a promise to pull out of Afghanistan, pull forces out of Afghanistan. He was going to do it. He did do it. He did it really without taking much notice of his allies. He did it partly, I think, to clear the decks for the confrontation with China, partly because American public opinion was expecting him to, and he did it on a short time scale without really calculating the human rights impact of that. I read in the press this morning that there is a real prospect of famine in Afghanistan, and we are all, in a way, bound up with that. We will try to do what we can from the outside, but it's going to be much more difficult. Many women and girls are now facing many more risks in Afghanistan than they did before. So yes, we need values, but let's not pretend that in the real world it's going to be possible to live up to them all the time. And there will be messy compromises to be made. I think I call it hard choices. Foreign policy is always about hard choices, and you can't always make the right ones in terms of your values, unfortunately.
Yes, I would love to ask you lots of questions, and I hopefully we'll get a chance to ask a few more. But let us see if our audience would like to raise a few. There are so many areas, of course, that are covered in the book, and please go ahead.
just staying with Afghanistan, going back 40 years, arguably was the genesis of all the Islamic terrorism we've had. In other words, the role played by the US and the UK in a much smaller way to support the uprising against the regime there. Would it not have been better? Would you not have avoided 40 years of horror for both the West and for the Afghans if the West had never gone into Afghanistan 40 years ago?
Well, I've worked with so many politicians in my life that I'm rather nervous about answering hypothetical questions. And there are an awful lot of what ifs in history. With hindsight, you can say it should have been done better. I suppose I should make a couple of points. First of all, of course, it was the Soviet Union that went into Afghanistan in 1979. And so that was part of a long series of Afghanistan's neighbors and others intervening in its own affairs. And of course, it was the West that was attacked in an unprovoked way at 9/11. That attack on the West is what pitchforked us into the NATO operations in Afghanistan, and it was an entirely, unprovoked and terrible massive attack on New York City and Washington. So I think, you can all deduce what you like from history. I think the fact that we went into Afghanistan to prevent al-Qaeda carrying out further terrorist attacks on the West was legitimate. I think the fact that we got bogged down there and that became a real problem and actually probably fueled terrorism and extremism was a series of errors that took us to that point. And of course, they were worse in Iraq. So the history of our interventions in that part of the world is not a happy one. But I would say that the initial decision to take action in Afghanistan against al-Qaeda was inevitable after 9/11 and was probably right. So from there came all sorts of problems. Is that a diplomatic and evasive answer? Yes, probably is. But anyway,
can I just,
thank you.
Just to follow up on that, when you look back at the history of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, all of it, can you now, in any clear sense, say why, failure is a word that follows many of those interventions?
Yes, just before answering, let me say that not all the West's interventions since the end of the Cold War have been failures. I see in the newspapers now that Bosnia is back on the at-risk list, but the Balkans have had 20 years of relative stability, and indeed a number of them have now joined the EU. We did stop the ethnic cleansing, and we did give these countries a capacity and a chance to build back. So I would say that was an intervention which can be justified. Afghanistan and Iraq, well, the West went into them with different motives. Afghanistan was post 9/11. Iraq, looking back, it was quite wrong for Bush and Blair to decide to try and sort out the problems they saw in Iraq by a massive military intervention and all that followed. I think we have learned that this use of Western military forces to go and effectively occupy countries with very different cultures and histories has not worked. And I don't think there's any prospect of doing it again in the foreseeable future, because I don't think publics or parliaments would accept it. Let's also, though, just accept the corollary that not intervening also has implications. As we see in Syria and in many other countries now, Yemen, where there are civil wars out of control and an enormous amount of human suffering. So back to the hard choices. Intervening is often wrong.
We do sell weapons to Saudi who use them in Yemen, though.
I beg pardon?
So we sell weapons to Saudi who use them in Yemen. So
yeah.
You say we're not intervening, but we could make different decisions there.
Well, we could, but I'm not sure that would stop the civil war in Yemen. Again, it's a choice. Is it jobs in Britain for arms manufacturers, or is it jobs in America or France that we choose to do? No, what I'm saying, if the West stands aside, as we've done from the Syrian civil war, and that continues, we still get impact from it, in terms of migration and so on. There is still massive human suffering. And so there are no easy answers to these things at all. But I don't think simply deciding that we're going to never try to take any part in conflict prevention, in reducing tensions, in mitigating through diplomatic means and development means, I don't think we should rule any of that out, because I think we still have a role in trying to help countries come out of crisis and prevent them spiraling into the kind of chaos that there is now in Yemen and Syria.
Thank you. Any more questions? Sorry, I interrupted.
Hello? Yep, hi. It was famously said that NATO was designed to keep Russia out, America in, and Germany down. With America beginning to look a little bit more out than they were before, is there a case now for Germany to be less down? They contribute around 1% of their GDP to NATO at the moment. So is there a case for them having a more higher profile role?
Yes, absolutely there is. It was actually the first Secretary General of NATO, who was a Brit, called General Ismay, who made up that rather nice little phrase, which has echoed down history. Of course, we stopped trying to keep the Germans down, a few years after the creation of NATO. And for most of the period since then, we've been urging the Germans to spend more on defense. Their armed forces were quite large during the Cold War, very much static in Germany. After the Cold War, they took the peace dividend in a dramatic way and ramped down their defense spending a great deal. But yes, I think all the other major Western military countries like Britain and France would like to see Germany spending more on defense. We cannot expect the Americans to go on bearing this disproportionate burden that they've had in NATO ever since the foundation of NATO. Actually, the Americans have done a disproportionate share of the costs of defending NATO or providing forces and the budget for NATO. So we need Europe to do more. We need it to do more in a way that doesn't just duplicate what there is in NATO, but actually adds capacity to the overall effort. And we need to fill in for the Americans when they need to take their troops to go off and deal with their higher priorities as they see them in the Indo-Pacific. Germany, to be fair to them, are now increasing their defense budget from a very low level, but it is going up, and of course they have a very large economy. So a slightly higher percentage of their GDP spent on defense will mean a great deal of extra money. It will take a decade to come through into new equipment and new battalions and capabilities, but they are doing that gradually. And I don't think that the new chancellor in Germany will change that. I think he accepts the need for that. It's a gradual and slow process. But NATO is changing. The great thing about NATO is that it is adaptable. It's based on a treaty which is not long and complicated with lots of legal pros and annexes, but a simple political commitment to all for one and one for all. That is why the Trump suggestions that he might only provide the amount of security that countries were willing to pay for was pretty damaging to the overall concept of NATO, because it struck at that fundamental bargain that this is a political commitment among allies, and you have to have confidence that they would be there if ever the day came you needed to activate that NATO article about collective defense. I think Joe Biden has done a lot to mend that, but damage was done by Trump's transactional attitude to NATO. And I think the European countries, without Britain, are now thinking, hey, we need to do more to think about our own security and be prepared one day potentially for the Americans to be not nearly as committed as they are now.
Take one more from this section.
What should the government do to help Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe?
Oh.
Poor Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe. Your heart can't help but warm to the efforts that her husband has been making on his hunger strike outside the FCO for the last 2 weeks now. Well, I think myself that the government should pay the debt that we owe Iran for tanks that were ordered actually under the Shah, which were paid for but never delivered. I mean, that is a debt that Britain has had. I'm afraid I don't agree with the minister who said in Parliament today that it would be like paying for a hostage. I think there are ways of diplomats working this out, that Britain pays the debt and Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe gets released. And I think just to leave her like that and to, as it were, take a position that we can't pay because it might be seen as a ransom for a hostage, guarantees that she will be in Iran for the indefinite future. So I think we should bite the bullet, recognizing that foreign policy is always about difficult choices, and in this case, make the humanitarian choice of paying the debt that we've owed them since 1979.
I interviewed some who's former permanent secretary, also of course, a couple of days ago, and he said, there are talks obviously ongoing. We're talking about how to pay the money, not just in cash, but in maybe in medicines. There's inflation on the cash, but it's all very difficult. There's the nuclear deal that's being discussed. COP is still happening, and the Iranians are just coming to town. And yet, lots of people are thinking, and I put this to him, and you would obviously agree, I'm sure, that every day that ticks by that a little girl has not got her mother with her. Can you imagine for us, or tell us what the reasons plausibly might be for this not being delivered by Christmas?
Well, I have been out of the loop for some time, Geeta, but this has been going on for years and years and years. And I mean, I think that the UK system has got itself hung up on this point that we don't pay ransom for hostages, which is a perfectly fair point. I mean, if people are taken hostage at gunpoint by a terrorist group, for many years now, we have not paid ransom to get them out, because if we did, that would just guarantee that 5 times as many Brits would be taken by terrorist groups and held to ransom. But this is different. This is with a state. This is over a clear issue that's been there for 40 years. Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe's now been in detention for what, 5, 6 years or something, on what is clearly a trumped-up charge. So the only reason for not getting it settled is this sensitivity about being seen to pay money for hostages. And I don't know whether they can overcome that in the next few weeks. I mean, they've found it impossible to overcome it in the last few years. So I'm not all that optimistic, but I think that Mr. Ratcliffe has certainly put it back on the agenda again in a very dramatic way. And perhaps when the immediate sort of press attention has settled and it's quieter, somebody can find a diplomatic way of sorting this out, because it seems to me it's over time, long over time, to get it sorted out. That's what we have diplomats for.
Is it sort of effectively wrong, if we're saying that there is no ethical foreign policy, would it be more honest to politicians to say we're not basing our decisions on whether we are, allies with Saudi but not with Iran, on any kind of decision about whether we think one is morally right or wrong, but purely in self-interest, so that we don't have to have these convoluted reasons?
Yeah, I don't think that you can base government's foreign policy on just on this issue of ethics. I mean, foreign policy has to be based on national interest. That will include promotion of what we believe are our universal human rights that we're proud to hold, equally our commercial interests, the interests of British citizens, our security interests. There will always be a whole mix of things, actually, and governments tend to choose whichever part of that spectrum suits them on any particular case. So, no, I mean, I don't think that we should get hung up on any particular aspect. I think we should try and find a diplomatic solution, a reasonable, realistic solution to this problem, even if it's not an entirely tidy one, because the status quo has been dragging on for years and years and seems to me to be simply, untenable now.
Thank you.
A couple from the middle here, middle section.
Hello there. I just wanted to carry on the conversation about Afghanistan. I appreciate that this has been discussed a little bit already, but I was quite interested in what Tony Blair had to say in August when he wrote on his website about why we shouldn't abandon the people of Afghanistan, which I thought was personally quite an interesting take, given the incentives for originally entering Afghanistan. And he argued, in my opinion, quite eloquently, but I wasn't necessarily convinced by the overall direction he was trying to take the argument, because in my opinion, and the way that I interpret the situation, is that we as in the allied nations that were involved in Afghanistan, don't really have any leverage now with the regime, that's the Taliban, to effectively help the people of Afghanistan, which he's now articulating as a priority. And I wondered if you could give me any kind of color on how you might interpret that, and how you feel the situation is going to pan out for the future of the people. Because as obviously we're looking at it now in a very fresh way, but it's been 20 years, $500 billion I think, maybe more. And the only thing that you could argue has changed in Afghanistan is there's more craters, and very little in the way of kind of reform. It's, if anything, a regressive step. So very much an open-ended question, but I'd be interested to hear your take on Blair's essay back in August, if you could. Thank you.
Well, yes, thank you very much. Let me come at it from this angle. I thought that the British government, British ministers, failed to anticipate the emotional power in this country of that chaotic final few days in Kabul. My own feeling is that I think they thought of it as a sort of military operation, that you'd get the troops out, and yes, it'd be a bit messy, but that would be the end of the operation. I think what they failed to understand was the amount of commitment and investment that individual people felt that they'd made in Afghanistan. We had the very emotional speeches in Parliament from Tom Tugendhat and others who'd served there, who'd left friends buried in Afghanistan. So the military clearly felt that they had some obligations to the people of Afghanistan. But the thousands and thousands of British people who'd worked there as civilian administrators or working for aid organizations or charities or educational organizations or health organizations, many thousands of people actually felt that they had made a personal commitment to individuals in Afghanistan and tried to change their lives and improve them. And to watch this chaotic withdrawal happening was deeply emotional and upsetting for many, many people. And I don't think the government saw that coming. And so what we're left with now, as you rightly say, we've got no troops there. We don't have any effective leverage. The leverage was actually taken away when Trump decided that he was going to negotiate the withdrawal of American forces direct with the Taliban, no involvement of the legitimate Afghan government that we've been supporting for 20 years, and did a deal with the Taliban. So that undercut the government. And then Joe Biden further undercut the government by deciding to stick with the timetable, whatever the situation on the ground. And I think everybody misunderstood the power of the Taliban in the countryside of Afghanistan, their capacity to come back quickly. So that's where we are now. I think a lot of people left feeling extremely uneasy that we have left women, girls, women judges, civilians who've taken real risks to try and improve their country, completely vulnerable to the Taliban. I wouldn't say that 20 years and $500 billion has left only craters in Afghanistan. I think we have left a generation of people in Afghanistan who have had some experience of how life could be under a better governance. You know, we have had women, girls who've gone to school. We have had a lot of people vaccinated. We have introduced a lot of people in Afghanistan to other ways of living than the way that they are doing now. I don't think that human capital is totally wasted. But you're right, we don't have any direct leverage. We have all the money that Afghanistan still has in central banks frozen at the moment, but it's not going back because nobody recognizes the Taliban, and people are starving in Afghanistan. What can we do about that? I think we have to be prepared to work with the Taliban in the end. Foreign policy is a dirty business. It's about difficult choices. But I think the humanitarian catastrophe developing in Afghanistan means we've got to bite our lip and work with the Taliban, try and get them to see it's in their interest as well. If they're going to govern the country, they need to have the resources, and they probably need to have some international help with the huge crisis that's developing there. That won't be comfortable, but I think it's better than trying to wall off Afghanistan and leave the people to the fate that lies in front of them at the moment. I mean, Tony Blair puts things in sort of moral terms, and that's his way. I would put them in realistic terms, that it's in our interests as well in the interests of the people of Afghanistan to try to find a way of helping them. If that means working with the Taliban, we have to do it.
You haven't so far talked about Russia. I haven't read your book, so I'm sure you cover it there. But I mean, do you view Putin and his government as bad as they are portrayed in our press? Do you have any should we have any understanding of how they see the world, and especially given the history of Russia versus the Western Europe? Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a word about Russia. No, you're quite right. I do talk about it a bit in the book, yes. Russia is, in a way, the polar opposite of China. Uh, China is a rising power with a growing economy and a very expansive, optimistic view of its role in the world. Russia is a declining power, declining demographically, declining economically, but with a very powerful armed forces and a lot of nuclear weapons. And that makes it dangerous, because I think Russia does see itself as having been badly treated by the West in the years after the end of the Cold War, that it was ripped off, that the West took advantage of Russia's weakness in those years, and that Putin is determined that whatever else happens, Russia is to be treated, you know, as a serious and a country to be taken notice of, even if it means behaving in a way that is almost completely destructive. Because, I mean, that's the thing that strikes me about Russia. Almost all their actions are intended to destroy, to disrupt, to subvert the West in every possible way, rather than playing any useful, constructive part in building anything else. And in the process, their economy is, you know, is in serious decline, is entirely now dependent on oil and gas, effectively. They've missed out on the technological revolution going on elsewhere, except in the area of armed forces. So it is a dangerous country. Yes, I think we're right to be worried, because Putin feels that by behaving recklessly, he draws attention to Russia. He makes people sit up and take Russia seriously. He is trying desperately to hang on to the rather few remaining countries in Russia's periphery where he holds sway, like Belarus. And he views the West as deeply antagonistic towards Russia. It's antagonistic towards Russia mainly because of the way Russia has treated Western countries, not least in the UK. See the poisoning of poor Mr. Litvinenko and the Skripals 2 or 3 years ago. And so it's a weak, dangerous country that needs to be managed, and I think we need to leave a door open for the Russians to realize that in the longer term their interests will lie in working with their European neighbors as China becomes more powerful and potentially a longer-term threat to Russia on its eastern border. But I think that's a long game with Russia. Right at the moment, it's a question of containing them and trying to limit the damage they do rather than working effectively with them, because they're not interested in constructive contributions to problems facing the world. Did anybody notice very much Russian contribution to the Glasgow Climate Conference? I certainly didn't. That's not the kind of thing that Putin is interested in.
There are extraordinary things happening, not just briefly with, you know, with the Belarusian Polish border. I mean, it sounds like something from a novel. The accusations and allegations that they're hearing. Just if you were in government now, what would you be advising how to deal with that?
I'm afraid Mr. Lukashenko is completely out of control. Yes, and he is looking for ways to do as much harm, you know, and hurt the West as hard as he can, because he feels, I mean, quite rightly, that the West is now bearing down on him economically with sanctions and so on. And so, yeah, I think he is instrumentalizing human lives. He's using human lives as a pawn in his effort to put pressure on the West. What would I do? Well, I think I saw that the government had agreed to deploy British forces to help the Polish authorities on that border. I think that's right. I think we're right to show solidarity with Poland. This is completely unacceptable what he's doing. I also think that he doesn't have unlimited scope from Putin to do whatever he wants. I think Putin's interests with the West are not the same as Lukashenko's interests. And when Lukashenko suggested that Belarus might turn the gas off, Putin quite quickly contradicted him. So he's a rather awkward ally of Putin. Putin doesn't have many allies, and so he doesn't like to throw them away. But there are limits to how far Lukashenko can go before Putin will start to rein him in. For the moment, I think the West have to do everything possible to stop these refugees getting to Belarus in the first place, put pressure on airlines and so on, and then help the Poles and Lithuanians stand up to this completely unreasonable pressure.
Very interesting.
Take some more from this side. Anybody up here at all? No? I'm going to come down here.
There are a couple here, I think. Yes.
Thank you. Coming back to Europe, Can you say something about how you see Hungary and Poland as players in Europe, and will they affect the stability of the European Union?
Thank you very much. Yes. I mean, first of all, I don't take seriously mutterings about countries like Hungary or Poland leaving the EU. I think one thing Brexit has done probably is to inoculate all other EU countries from the idea of trying to leave the EU. Because that Article 50 is, my goodness, it's a pretty brutal instrument, as the UK has found out. And both Hungary and Poland, of course, depend very heavily on flows of EU money. I think what they are doing is showing that this one-size-fits-all integrationist approach to building the EU is coming to the end of the line, end of its limits. There are aspects of European integration that those countries are not going to accept. They are going about it in a very cack-handed way, in my view. But I think there is a risk in push towards further and further integration around a single economic model, a single social and political model, if the EU is to stay together and to advance in the decades ahead. So my own feeling is that, looking at it 10 years from now, the EU will be a looser construct than it is now. I don't see that it can stay as tightly integrated as it is now, and therefore, with that looser EU, I can see the UK being able to find a new niche, which is not rejoining, but which is a cooperative partnership with a rather looser EU structure. I think Italy, as well as Poland and Hungary, have rather different approaches to the idea of European integration than perhaps they did in the past, and therefore we are set on a course of seeing the EU becoming a bit more flexible and adaptable rather than the rather rigid way it's been run so far.
Thank you. Yes, I think there's a
Thank you. Congratulations on your book. I just want to follow on from Geeta's question about the migrant crisis, not specifically at the Polish border, but all around. And how do you think foreign policy can influence and help resolve that problem? One of the things that I think of when I think of the migrant crisis is the brain drain from countries struggling with poverty, lack of opportunities, and if their best people are leaving, how are they ever going to pull themselves up? And it just perpetuates that cycle.
Yes, thank you very much, and I completely agree. I mean, first of all, it's a human tragedy for those who are so desperate they decide to take the enormous risks involved in coming to Europe and trying to integrate in a new home. And it's an enormous loss to the countries concerned, who can not afford that loss. I think that's absolutely true. And what can foreign policy do? I mean, we would all like to help create conditions in the countries where these migrants are coming from, Syria, Yemen, Eritrea, Afghanistan, and so on, create conditions there where people want to stay in their own country and work and contribute to the development of the country rather than heading for the West. That's a long process. We're still working 20 years on from the Balkans in getting the Balkan countries stable, and they're right on our doorstep. So it's even harder in countries that are further away. There are the short-term mitigating, crisis managing responses, finding legal routes for people to come, helping them to settle in Western countries, supporting people in the refugee camps in places like Lebanon and Jordan. And then there's the longer term problem of trying to develop economies that will attract people to go home. And that could take a long time, I think. There is no simple solution here. And certainly trying to keep people out with barbed wire fences, is not the way Europe is going to handle the migrant crisis in the years to come. It's quite interesting to me that a country like Germany, that took 1.5 million refugees 5 years ago, has just had a very moderate, centrist, non-populist election campaign and elected a new chancellor who is all those things. So it is possible for Western countries to integrate and assimilate a large number of refugees and still come out, without their politics being fractured and polarized. And we will all need some of these human talents, But most of all, I think it's important in the long term to be trying to create the conditions where people can go back home again and not feel the need to leave in the first place.
Thank you. I'm going to ask just a couple of very quick questions, quick fire ones, because then I'm going to let you go and sign some books. Is Britain corrupt, as Boris Johnson denies? In 20 seconds.
That's a very unfair BBC question, Geeta. You have 20 seconds to answer an impossible question. No, Britain is not corrupt, but I think there has been a worrying spread of corruption in some of the institutions that we hold dear, not least Parliament. I think standards have fallen. They haven't been tightly implemented and policed as they should have been. Leadership comes from the top. So there's a diplomatic hint. I think our leaders need to set an example of being irreproachable and for that to percolate down through. No, the country isn't corrupt, the judges aren't corrupt, the media isn't corrupt, the civil service isn't corrupt, but there are some areas of life where there is some corruption.
Excellent answer. I'm going to ask you one very final one. My children absolutely love Yes Minister. The scripts are brilliant. It still stands the testimony of time. Peter actually worked with my brother, who was in the civil service in the Foreign Office with David Miliband. My husband worked in government for Tony Blair as well. All cards on the table at the very end. I didn't notice. What does it take to get to the top of the diplomatic service? And if my children want to go and do that, what advice would you give them?
First of all, can I say that for about 20 years, I couldn't bear to watch Yes Minister because I did it all day long and I didn't want to come back and watch a comedy program in the evening. It was too true. And by the way, it sells all around the world, even in China. You know, they bought Yes Minister and they recognized it. You know, there's something universal about that sort of approach to power. I don't think your brother ever said Yes Minister as I heard him. How do you succeed in the diplomatic service? I mean, like in any other profession, I think by taking it seriously, you need to be the sort of person who gets on with other people, who can make networks, who can obviously analyze what's going on in a country, but most of all, who can empathize. And I used to say that my definition of a good diplomat is somebody who arrives in a foreign country knowing nobody, and starts his posting or her posting with contacts and ends it with friends. And if you can do that, you're a good diplomat.
That is a wonderful, wonderful end to our evening.
Hey.
Lord Ricketts, can I just say from me, thank you hugely. It's been fantastic to read the book. Definitely worth a read because there's a lot more in there that we've not been able to cover. And you learn from it and you're entertained as well. So thank you so much.
Very much indeed, Geeta.
Wow, what a fascinating discussion. What difficult questions. Has it always been like this throughout history? I suspect it has. Sorry for those of you who have not had an opportunity to ask a question, but Peter's going to be signing his book outside. Thank you so much for coming out. We'll be back on Wednesday. Just one more time, if I could ask you to show your appreciation for Geeta Guru-Murthy and our special guest tonight, Peter Ricketts. Thank you.